Now that we looked at how Han van Meegeren began as an art forger and was eventually wrapped up with the Nazis, and Hermann Goering selling art to Goering and then eventually being found out, and finally, before the end of his life, being turned into a kind of a cultural hero in the Netherlands, let's ask ourselves this question. Was Van Meegeren's practice, was his technique really any good? Here we see him creating one of the forgeries, I believe, here shown on the cover of Life magazine, during the time when he was trying to prove his innocence of being complicit with selling work to Nazis and instead being an art forger, which it took quite a bit to convince at first. And we see that he's mixing some probably oils together with pigments to create the work that you see behind him. Note that it is a fairly large work. Here I'm juxtaposing a self-portrait by Van Meegeren, not a forgery. He was an artist, though a kind of a failed artist, and his career wasn't really going anywhere until he started doing forgeries. And I'm showing it to you against a Vermeer called The Milkmaid. And so Van Meegeren was a sort of a second-rate artist, but I want to show you the difference between what he could do and what Vermeer could do by looking at composition in terms of what Vermeer was capable of. I believe that Vermeer had a corner of his hotel set aside specifically for painting that he turned into a studio. In doing so, this composition with figure here is predominant in Vermeer's work. We'll often see a window in the corner, sometimes some paintings in the background. Let's look at a few others, and we'll compare that to Van Meegeren's work and try to understand how people were fooled by this at all. Here we see the very famous Supper at Imaus that was the forgery created by Van Meegeren in 1937. Let's look at some things that are very obvious that the people standing around here should very much know if they had looked at any Vermeer work at all. Most Vermeer work is very small and intimate. The paintings are not very large, maybe 2 by 3 feet at the very most. Look at the size of this massive painting. Don't you think that that would raise a red flag? So essentially we're being asked to think that this is Vermeer's early work that is somehow done on a monumental scale when his more mature work was done on a very small and reduced scale. It's a logic that doesn't seem to make any sense. And in this canvas, what we see is a collection of figures, some with their back to us, in a kind of a Last Supper motif, except this is Summer at Imaus, where we get no sense of physical space whatsoever. We see overlapping of individuals, but we don't see any of the kind of intimate space that Vermeer was known for creating. Now let's take a look at the Milkmaid more closely to see what kind of a spatial relationship Vermeer was actually capable of. Once again, he uses the corner of the room with this strong vertical line cut at the bottom by a diagonal and a horizontal. Very simple, straightforward composition. He situates the figure in the center of all of this, and he focuses attention on the action, which is the pouring of the liquid out of the jug. So what this essentially does is divide the canvas into a series of large and small rectangles. Needless to say, none of that is going on in what we see here in the Van Meegeren painting, Supper at Imaus. Not only that, but the way that Van Meegeren is forming the skeletonization of the human head seems to be very odd, right? Does it not feel like something is odd here? The eyeballs are too recessed. There's too much shadow around them. There's none of the subtlety of the Vermeer in the handling of the paint. Here, we can also see it here in the way that her hands are done very simply. If I contrast to the way Van Meegeren is doing hands, of course this is a larger canvas and more space to deal with. The kind of handling here seems to be more realistic than is what's going on in the face. And actually I would say that where Van Meegeren is getting his inspiration is not from Vermeer, but from Caravaggio, whose very famous Supper at Emos painting shown here gives you an idea of where the hand gestures are coming from. Caravaggio, an Italian 17th century painter who was very famous for this dramatic light and dark called chiaroscuro technique that he was using, is something I think that Van Meegeren is actually aspiring to in his forgeries of Vermeer, oddly enough. Vermeer, an artist who did nothing at all like the kind of light and dark contrasts that Caravaggio was capable of. Here's a very good example of the kind of chiaroscuro that Van Meegeren is doing. Again, look at the deep eye sockets and the highlights right next to them. This is very much more a Caravaggesque painterly quality than Vermeer. These lines are very, very hard to achieve. It's done through glazing, which is a layering of thin color, one on top of another, over and over again, so that the light colors here in the cheek are also deep underneath the darks, and vice versa. This is how you avoid having too much contrast. This is how you create subtle contrast, the kind that Vermeer was capable of doing. Caravaggio's doing it, but he's not so interested in creating these subtle, very soft, subtle gradations between the dark and the light. Caravaggio wants it to be much more forceful. And so when it comes down to it, I think that Van Meegeren was really struggling with the dark and light contrast, and part of that was he wasn't doing as many layers of paint. He couldn't get the thin quality of the paint layers to happen because he was using this substance, a plastic substance called Bakelite, which was giving him the cracking when he was putting the painting afterwards in his pizza oven. He couldn't get the very subtle gradations of dark and light to happen because of the practice that he invented with this new Bakelite material. Here's a really good contrast between Van Meegeren on the left and the girl with the pearl earring on the right. Look at the way that Van Meegeren is making the face look so flat, and how Vermeer, by contrast, has the face not only in this beautiful, subtle, rounded pose, but the head is actually not only turned towards us, but slightly canted, right? A slight angle. Let me draw a line here, and I'll show you what I mean. If I draw a line down the middle of the Vermeer face, we'll see that this subtle turn of the head with a canted angle is what's happening. But no, in the amateurish, Van Meegeren version, that line is straight up and down, showing us that he is barely struggling with getting the facial features correct, never mind being able to turn the head ever so slightly. Now, back to two figures. So we've got eye line between the two of them, though we can't see the painter. This is the allegory of painting. So we've got our two figures joined by this line. In the background, he throws in a map, which is very interesting compositionally because it takes up another section of his quadrant. So we've got a big quadrant with a smaller quadrant inside it, and the roof line running along the top. So he's starting to get quite complex. Also, we see perspective in the floor tiling. And where are all these lines running to? But to the face of the sitter. So as you can see, the kind of composition going on here is very complex because Vermeer is using the geometry of the painting itself to work out how the viewer should see the painting. Let's see that work again in another Vermeer. We see that he's using the same kind of corner of his hotel as a studio with the windows along the one side. He's dividing the wall space up into rectangles and orthogonal lines. Let's look at what's going on with the floor tiles in this case. They are running directly to the mirror image of the sitter. This is not a painting in the background on the wall, it is actually a mirror reflecting the woman at the harpsichord. And all of these orthogonal lines run directly to her so that we know that she is the focus of the painting. And I would point out that the light is coming from these windows, which exist in his studio, I believe, and were the source of his own light as he was painting this. And let's see by contrast what Van Meegeren is capable of. He's got these four flattened figures squished up against each other, though there's supposed to be much more space, collected in a kind of a no space, right? We don't really get a sense of the background. We don't really understand the kind of spatial relationships between them and their surroundings. We get a little sense of the figures looking at each other in a kind of a basic triangular composition between the three characters that we can see, and he's kind of very subtly working out what the background might be like, as I'm pointing out here with this horizontal and vertical line. But let me tell you, that must have really fooled the experts who thought, oh, this is Vermeer in the early days working out his compositional complexity. And that's, I think, what must have gotten people so badly fooled about the poor painterly quality of this kind of work, to think that it was a real Vermeer. In order to be able to understand this ourselves, we need to look at the entire body of someone's work. We need to look at all of the Vermeers at once, which we actually can do by going online. You can't do by going to a museum, but by doing this online, you can see all 35 or 40 of the Vermeers, and you can come to your own conclusions.